This is Thomas Wayne Riley, and you have found yourself in the American Southwest. This is part 8 of my series over Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War. One thing is sure, both parties are still determined. The fearful sacrifice of McSween's clique does not seem to satisfy either side. A deep revenge will be sought by the sheriff's posse for the loss of their pet leader Beckwith, and a still stronger spirit exists on the part of the McSween men to retaliate for the death of their headman, McSween. Lieutenant Colonel Dudley to Acting Assistant Adjutant General of New Mexico on July 20th, 1878. Despite many of the regulators believing the Lincoln County War ended with the murder of McSween, the volcano still simmered beneath the surface. For the next month, the remaining regulators hopped around Lincoln County, where they rearmed and remounted. George Coe, a regulator, commented that, quote, "We resorted to all manner of means to do so. Some of our horses were given to us, some were swapped for, and others were swiped from off the range." End quote. Swiped from off the range is a nice way to say they stole them from the Apaches. And on August 5th, they were finally caught in the act of this horse theft from the reservation. As 19 of the regulators descended upon the horses, the Apaches fought back. Among those regulators were Billy the Kid, Middleton, Doc Scurlock, Beaudry, French, Folliard, Brown, and the cousins George and Frank Coe. Godfrey, who was still head of the Indian Agency, although not for much longer on account of his blatant corruption, but Godfrey heard the shooting, along with his assistant Bernstein. Bernstein seems thus far to have been a McSween sympathizer, while Godfrey was in the pocket of the house. When the two men heard the shooting, Bernstein mounted up and rode toward the gunfire. But not long afterwards, his horse returned to Godfrey, riderless. Now, what exactly happened to Bernstein is a little unclear even to this day, but I think a clear picture emerges with what I'm about to tell y'all. For the past 4 weeks, Sheriff Pepin's posse, and occasionally some soldiers, were still on the hunt for the remaining regulators. Everyone was keeping an ear to the ground for the outlaws. So when Bernstein's horse returned riderless, Godfrey hightailed it to the fort to request some backup from Dudley. Dudley promptly handed over some soldiers. When Godfrey and the soldiers came upon the regulators still in their gun battle with the Apaches, they gathered up all the new horses, left 4 of their own, and took off into the mountains. So what happened to Bernstein? Well, nothing pretty, that's for sure. Godfrey and the soldiers would eventually find the man lying face down with 4 bullet holes in his body. His rifle, his pistol, and his ammo were gone, and his pockets had been turned out. Godfrey immediately sent a telegram to the corrupt Governor Axtell, which read, quote, "Morris J. Bernstein, my clerk today, was brutally murdered by McSween outlaws." End quote. Did the regulators murder a man that had seemed sympathetic to their cause earlier? Was it the heat of battle? I don't believe so. Because as it so happened, the regulators weren't the only ones in the area. At the exact same time they were having their shootout with the Apaches, a group of New Mexican Hispanics were also in the area looking for some stolen cows. A little over a month later, the Cimarron News and Press published an article detailing exactly what had happened that fateful day. It read that Bernstein had actually been killed by, quote, "a Mexican who was with a party going from San Patricio to Tularosa to assist in recovering a lot of stolen stock. When the Mexicans reached the water alongside of the road north of the agency, they stopped to water their horses. Bernstein saw them, and probably supposing them to be a party of the Regulators, attacked them with a party of Indians. He rode up to one Mexican and fired 2 shots at him. The man took shelter behind a tree. Bernstein, still advancing, rode close to the tree and fired again at the man, who returned the fire and killed Bernstein. The Mexican says he acted strictly in self-defense and will at any time deliver himself up for trial. His name is Atanasio Martinez. End quote. Now, of course, this news was completely ignored, and the hunt for the Regulators began again with fresh, hot zeal. Martinez would never stand trial for the unfortunate but clearly evident self-defense and murder of Bernstein. George Coe would write of this mix-up and say, quote, "Our future outlook was anything but favorable. It included nothing but a very urgent reason for fast traveling. Therefore, we agreed that the only sane thing to do was to disband. Ammunition and supplies were getting low with no prospect of replenishing them. Our patron had been killed, and we were adrift without any plan of action." End quote. Instead of disbanding and fleeing throughout the land, which would have been the smartest action to take, the tightly knit group decided instead to stay together, despite what Coe envisioned them doing, and their next plan was to leave Lincoln County. They were now wanting to head north to Fort Sumner. Fort Sumner played an important part during the rounding up of the Mescalero and Navajo, which I talked about in the Apache series, but by 1868 the nearby Bosque Redondo Reservation experiment had come to an end. The Mescalero had already run off, and the Navajo were allowed to return to their current lands, as in today their current lands. The fort closed down shortly afterwards, before it was bought by a Lucien Bonaparte Maxwell. He was a land baron. He would turn the fort into a grand stop on the cattle trail. But Lucien would die in 1875, so the entire fort would be turned over to his son, Pete Maxwell. 2 of the Regulators would actually not run to Fort Sumner, though. Those 2 men were Doc Scurlock and Charlie Beaudry. They were both married men who had homes in the Ruidoso Valley. They felt it best to return to their wives instead of fleeing the country. After weeks of threats and vile taunts from the evil men of Lincoln, Miss McSween would also sneak out of town and head for Las Vegas. But she would return soon. Many others also left Lincoln as the violence seemed to hang in the air. Beckwith, the old Southerner, who had a ranch down in the Pecos region, he would come up to Lincoln after losing his son during the big killing, and he would shotgun a man dead in his doorway. I will let author Maurice Fulton tell the tale. It's from his book History of the Lincoln County War. He wrote, quote, "The loss of his son preyed upon old man Beckwith's mind. He put the blame upon Johnson, feeling that if it had not been for Johnson's persuasion, Bob Beckwith might have stayed out of the fight. The upshot was that one day, about 4 weeks after the fight at Lincoln, the old man took a shotgun and marched over to the house occupied by Johnson and his family. Calling his son-in-law to the doorway, he shot him down as his wife looked on, holding an infant son in her arms." End quote. Lincoln would continue to be a violent place in the American Southwest, at least for a time. It was so violent, in fact, that a recent colony of Mormon immigrants who had arrived the year prior and who were staying on a part of Chisholm's range which they had bought, they took up their stakes and departed the territory. About 6 wagon loads of them. They had stayed out of the fight, but they were under constant pressure from the Seven Rivers Boys and the Dolan House faction to enter on the side against McSween. Fulton writes of this and says, quote, "After the battle in July, Turner and his following had returned to Roswell and indulged in threats toward the colony. Fearing that these threats might be put into execution, the whole group of Mormons left one night for Las Vegas. It was perhaps well that they did, for Turner's gang came the next morning to their homes. Had they remained, they might have suffered more than they already had from the attentions of the Turner posse." End quote. Turner, if you'll recall, he had led the assault against the Chisholm Ranch a few episodes back. It was on July 4th. But he eventually would retreat before gathering up the Pecos River men and fighting in the big killing. A little over a week after the shootout at the Mescalero Reservation, the Regulators, minus Beaudry and Scurlock, were traveling north along the Pecos River towards the Chisholm Ranch when they ran straight into the Chisholms themselves. Well, not John Chisholm. He was off in St. Louis. But the Regulators met up with John's brothers, Jim and Pitzer. They are ranch hands and cowboys, as well as Jim's daughter, Sally Chisholm. The Regulators had met Sally Chisholm before when they hid out at the ranch not too long ago in March of '78 and during the July 4th celebration. And while there, many a man among the Regulators fell for the beautiful Sally. George Coe had commented that, quote, "A more beautiful girl was not to be found," end quote. He also wrote about that previous March and said Sally was, quote, "a gracious hostess and made us feel completely at home. In fact, our hearts got to flapping so badly at times we could hardly be natural." Miss Sally did not do the cooking, but she managed the entire house, and we competed with each other as dishwashers in order to be near her and occasionally win a smile of approval. It has been generally conceded that Billy the Kid fell hard for Miss Sally's charms. Well, maybe he did, but he was not the only fella that took a tumble, though a precious lot of good it did any of us. End quote. During this reuniting, Billy the Kid, it seems, made his moves on Sally. She would write in her diary of this rendezvous and say, quote, "Indian tobacco sack presented to me on the 13th of August by William Bonney," end quote. And then a week later, when they'd finally all reached Fort Sumner, the Kid gave her another present, quote, "2 candy hearts given me by William Bonney on the 22nd of August," end quote. Nothing would come of this affection for Sally or Billy. Once in the town of Fort Sumner, the Regulators and crew began to party. Every Saturday night, Maxwell, who had bought the old fort, he had turned one of the buildings into a 20-room home, and every Saturday his son Pete Maxwell would throw a dance party, or as they called it, a baile. I've already mentioned that Billy was noted on multiple occasions by multiple people that he was a good dancer. It makes sense, his mother was a great dancer as well. For the next 2 Saturdays, the Regulators were at the Maxwell house dancing and having a great time. Probably the most fun they'd had in a long time. Frank Coe would write of the dances, quote, "House was full, whiskey free, not a white girl in the house, all Mexican and all good dancers. Polite, never say much upon the floor, but start off dancing when the tune started. Danced all night, boys swinging them high," end quote. Nearby the big house was a saloon. Beaver Smith's Saloon, to be precise, and that saloon at Fort Sumner also held dances or bailes. The bartender at Beaver Smith's Saloon really enjoyed his drinking and dancing, which he would for most of his life. His drinking would later get him into trouble, but this bartender was described by author Leon Metz as being a tall and lanky fellow who, quote, "cheerfully went along with the jests regarding his foot-tapping, hand-clapping, eye-winking joviality during the bailes," end quote. The bartender's nickname was Long John, but his real name was Pat Garrett, the same man who would kill William Bonney and finally end his reign of terror in New Mexico. But we're a long ways from that. Again, most sources claim Billy the Kid was in charge of the Regulators at this time, but this is not true. So many legends have been wrapped up and presented as fact around the Kid. It's hard to parse through it all, but I'm very glad author George R. Matthews did the hard work for us. It wasn't Billy the Kid that was in charge, it was John Middleton. And at this time, Middleton would write a letter to Weidenman saying that he didn't want Weidenman to join him on account of there was nothing he could do to help him. The letter was filled with a lot of bad news. The letter describes how the Chisholms were no longer backing the Regulators. It says that all of Tunstall's cattle had been stolen by Sheriff Pepin, who would resign as sheriff by the end of the year. It also expressed the Regulators' desires to find Dolan and to kill him. Middleton also admits the Regulators' next moves. They were going to outsteal the Seven Rivers Boys and Boss Russer Kinney, who at that time, they were roaming Lincoln and thieving cattle and horses wherever they could find them. Middleton said if they were doing it, the Regulators would too. He then ends the letter with, quote, "Take care of yourself. I want to see you again before we die," end quote. During these 2 weeks at Fort Stanton, the 2 Coe cousins would leave their group and move with their kin to northern New Mexico on the San Juan River, probably near the Farmington area. So the Regulator group was dwindling, despite picking up a few ex-buffalo hunters, actually. The members around this time probably only included Middleton, Billy the Kid, Brown, Waite, young Tom Folliard, Sam Smith, and Bowers. The dances had been a good distraction, but more hard and violent times were coming. On September 7th, the Regulators stole their first group of horses in Lincoln County since they'd stolen the Mescaleros. They took 15 horses from Charles Fritz. Charles Fritz was a brother of the dead Lincoln County House creator and one of the beneficiaries of the life insurance policy that ultimately got McSween killed. Fritz would identify to Dudley Do-Right at Fort Stanton 2 of the Regulators, Sam Smith and George Bowers. From the Fritz Ranch, the Regulators rode into Ruidoso to find Doc Scurlock and Charlie Beaudry. They didn't stay long, though. From the Ruidoso Valley, the Regulators, their stolen horses, and both Doc Scurlock and Charlie Beaudry, including their families, all moved to Fort Sumner. Once there, Scurlock and Beaudry would stay and find jobs. The Regulators and their stolen horses were on the move again, this time to Texas to sell the stolen horses. But on their way, they ran into the Chisholms yet again. Sally would say in her diary, quote, "Regulators come up with us at Red River Springs on 25th of September, 1878. End quote. Nothing about Billy in there. The Regulators and the stolen horses would ride into the Texas Panhandle with the Chisholms before parting ways, and eventually, William Bonney, Billy the Kid, he would make fast friends with a doctor and mail carrier named Henry Hoyt. But more on them in a bit. First, I gotta talk about what was going on up in Santa Fe, and also the new horror occurring in Lincoln County while the Regulators were out of town. There was no one regulating Lincoln County. The latest and best news I have to tell you is the removal of Governor Axtell. Mr. Angel has done good work for this territory, and I hope his work is not done yet. We will not be satisfied until Dudley is court-martialed and the murderers of Mr. Tunstall caught. Dudley ought to be indicted for the murder of Mr. McSween, and I think will be when we have court at Lincoln." That was a letter from Sam Corbett to Tunstall's father on September 23, 1878. Obviously, the corrupt and in the pocket of the Santa Fe ring, Governor Axtell, had gotten axed. He was out. The Angel, mentioned in the letter, was the investigator who had realized the corruptness of the whole mess down in Lincoln County, really the whole territory. I talked about him in the last episode and quoted from him quite a bit. Axtell's replacement was a man who loved New Mexico, although not a man from New Mexico, but a man named General Lew Wallace. He would take the oath on September 30th, 1878. General Lew Wallace, obviously, fought in the Civil War for the Yanks. He mustered 3 Zarov regiments, which were those colorfully suited regiments based off of French design. He was a lawyer by trade, and when he entered New Mexico, he fell in love with it, as one does. He wrote to his wife and described the land of enchantment. He wrote, quote, "What perfection of air and sunlight, and what a landscape discovered to show you when you come, a picture to make the fame of an artist, could he only put on canvas as it is. Soft blue sky, vast distance, bounded by purple walls as transparent and summery, it is hard to believe it. The sun goes down gradually in tinted clouds, which hover over the long purple mountain ranges. For as there are mountains in the east, so there are mountains in the west. Mountains, understand, not hills. Upon the going out of the day, the wind dies, leaving the night still and cool, and gradually growing cooler until at midnight, if you are indoors, a fire is cheery and enjoyable." End quote. He's not wrong. You'll also notice he's a rather good writer. And later, he will put it to use when he will write the legendary Ben-Hur. Actually, he writes it while he's governor of New Mexico. One of Wallace's first orders was to have a report prepared for him about the troubles, or rather the war, down in Lincoln County. He asked U.S. Marshal John Sherman, Jr. to prepare this report for him, which the man did, and handed it to the new governor only a few days later. In the report, U.S. Marshal Sherman Jr. stated that he had warrants out for the arrest of 9 men for the murder of Andrew Roberts at Blazer's Mill. Those men were the Regulators. Charlie Beaudry, Doc Scurlock, Steve Stevens, John Scroggins, George Coe, Fred Waite, Henry Brown, John Middleton, and W.M.H. Antrim, alias Kid, alias Bonnie. Sherman Jr. then stated that unfortunately he couldn't serve the warrants because the Regulators ruled Lincoln County. He wrote that he was, quote, powerless to execute the warrants owing to the disturbed condition of affairs in that county, resulting from the acts of a desperate class of men that now control it in such force as wholly to paralyze the efforts of its law-abiding citizens. End quote. It seems to me that the man was implying that the Regulators had control of the county and were terrorizing the law-abiding citizens. But reality could not have been further from that report. Here's author Matthews' take on the situation since the big killing. Quote, Sherman's meaning was clear, if untrue. He implied that the Regulators controlled Lincoln County and prevented the U.S. Marshal from making arrests. In reality, after the death of McSween, the Regulators never controlled Lincoln, town or county, nor did they terrorize the law-abiding citizens in that county. After Bernstein was killed on the Mescalero Apache Reservation, the Regulators had fled from Lincoln County to Fort Sumner in San Miguel County, and they began to disband. It was Jesse Evans and the Seven Rivers Boys who had preyed upon Lincoln County citizens for years and, recruited by Pepin and Matthews, had murdered Frank McNabb and attacked the town of Lincoln. John Kinney and his gang of thieves and murderers, as Sheriff Pepin's deputies, had pillaged San Patricio. Then, around the middle of September, another gang of ruthless thugs from Texas had perpetrated a senseless 3-week reign of violence upon Lincoln County citizens. Yet, Sherman implicated only the Regulators in his report to Governor Wallace. End quote. As had been the case for the entirety of the Lincoln County War, Tunstall, McSween, and then later the Regulators were all fighting back against a corrupt group of officials in Lincoln, at Fort Stanton, and in Santa Fe. Usually they were accompanied by local residents and townsfolk, both Anglo and Hispanic. The real perpetrators of the violence and lawlessness came from the gang of banditos the law and the house and the ring either hired or allowed to work in the county, without any repercussions. The lawlessness was part of the program that the people in power put in place. The Regulators struck blows in defense of justice. But there was consistently no justice to be had in Lincoln County, even when the court sided with McSween and the Regulators. The Army made sure it was all for naught. Now the new governor comes in and asks a man who is clearly in the ring's pocket about the situation, and this corruptness, this lawlessness, and twisting of justice continued. There would be no reprieve for the Regulators, not until each one of them were exiled in prison or dead. After the big killing, Maurice Fulton points out that the violence attracted more violence, and by August of 78, there were upwards of 6 bands of outlaws raiding the county with impunity. But what was this 3-week reign of terror from a group of ruthless Texan thugs that Matthews talks about? Well, it ain't pretty, that's for sure. But the law was quick to blame the Regulators, or at least obfuscate the truth enough to make it seem like they were adjacent to or in cahoots with the Regulators. During the Civil War, John Selman deserted the Confederate Army and headed to Mexico, already the sign of a weak man. But after the war, he returned to Texas and became a lawman of sorts. He was a deputy inspector of hides. Essentially, he fought against cattle rustlers and thieves. But truthfully, he was a cattle rustler and thief himself. Eventually, his own boss was accused of stealing hides, and his boss was killed for it. John Selman was from then on the run. Basically, from the same men he'd been hunting, arresting, and getting in shooting battles with for years. He gathered a group of men that became known as Selman's Scouts, and the thugs headed west to New Mexico, specifically Lincoln County. They would become known in Lincoln as the Rustlers, but they did a lot more than steal horses and cattle in Lincoln County. Almost as soon as they got to New Mexico, they began to raid. Their first target was the Pecos River Valley. Both Seven Rivers and Roswell became targets. In Roswell, the scouts threatened to burn Ash Upson's post office. Upson would later write Pat Garrett's biography, With the Man. After that, a nearby New Mexican Hispanic village, known as Berrendo, took the brunt of their violence. But they didn't stay long, and soon they were on the move up the Hondo Valley and into the Sacramento Mountains towards Ruidoso and Lincoln. They would stop right outside of Fort Stanton on September 27th. At this time, the Regulators were with the Chisholms over in Texas, trying to sell their own lot of stolen horses. But the county was under assault by a number of outlaw bands. So on the 27th, Selman's scouts stopped at a place known as Hudgens Saloon. There, they tried to persuade the owner of the saloon to head on into the fort for them and purchase around 1,000 rounds of ammunition. Hudgens refused. Undeterred, 4 of Selman's men decided to try their luck, and so they headed into the fort and successfully bought the ammunition. But once Dudley Do-Right heard of the rustlers' purchase, he had them stopped on the road, arrested, and brought back to the fort. Nothing came of the arrest, and they were released, but not before being forced to return all the ammo they purchased. Back at the saloon, after Selman was told of the failed mission, he turned his scouts loose. Here's what Matthews wrote of what happened next. Quote, "When the 4 scouts returned to the Hudgens Saloon and told their fellow miscreants what had happened, Selman and his thugs went on a rampage. They demolished the inside of the saloon and raped the owner's wife and sister. When a saloon patron interceded on behalf of the 2 women, he was pistol whipped. From the Hudgens Saloon, they blazed a trail of rape, pillage, and murder in the town of Lincoln and down the Rio Hondo Valley." End quote. I'm not sure that would have happened if the Regulators were in town. This is the violence the U.S. Marshal Sherman Jr. was placing at the feet of the Regulators. But the violence didn't stop there. Sam Corbett wrote at the time to Tunstall's father, who honestly by now must have thought the American West was the most violent and lawless place on earth. I mean, that's what I would get from all the letters and news he was receiving since the murder of his son. And he would have been right about his assumptions too. But Corbett wrote Tunstall, quote, "They broke open many houses, taking everything out, breaking dishes and so forth, took blankets, jewelry, stock, and anything they wanted, even stripped women of their clothing." End quote. At the Ella store, which had been a defensive place for the Regulator faction during the big killing, at the Ella store, many of the ex-McSween men holed up and held off Selman's scouts. But the marauders just went further east down the mountains. They apparently raped a woman not far from Lincoln. Then, 10 miles down the road, they stole $800 worth of goods. Even further down the road, they killed 2 men and 2 boys, all unarmed. They were just working in their fields. When someone asked the men who on earth they were, an unnamed scout replied, quote, "We are devils just come from hell." End quote. Clearly, things were yet again getting out of control in a place that had known little control outside of complete corruption since its founding. The new governor, after hearing about all of this from Dudley at Fort Stanton, he telegraphed President Rutherford B. Hayes and asked for martial law to be declared in Lincoln County. But that isn't what Governor General Lew Wallace would receive. Instead, the president would write, quote, "Rutherford B. Hayes, President of the United States, do hereby admonish all good citizens of the United States, and especially of the territory of New Mexico, against aiding, countenancing, abetting, or taking part in such unlawful proceedings, and I do hereby warn all persons engaged in or connected with said obstruction of the laws to disperse and return peaceably to their respective abodes on or before noon of the 13th day of October instant." End quote. Yeah, good luck with that. Governor Wallace would telegraph Mesilla, which would then send riders up to Lincoln with the command from the president. Governor Wallace then waited on further news of the violence, or hopefully the cessation of said violence in Lincoln. Waiting was all he could do for now. So over in the Texas Panhandle, oblivious to this new eruption of violence in Lincoln, Billy the Kid and the Regulators, what was left of them, they all settled down near a small village known as Tascosa. By now, the Regulators only consisted of their leader Middleton, William Bonney the Kid, Brown Waite, and young Folliard. It was in Tascosa that the Regulators were trying to offload their stolen horses. But along the way, they ran into a mail carrier by the name of Henry Hoyt. He would write of this encounter and say, quote, "As I ambled along, I met, well-mounted and armed, 5 men whom I had never seen before. They stopped and made inquiries about the location and direction of cattle ranches in the vicinity, volunteering the information that they had heard there was a scarcity of horses in the Panhandle, so had driven a herd from New Mexico to sell to the Texas cattlemen." End quote. Henry Hoyt wasn't a mail carrier by profession. It was something he was doing to make money while he was waiting for his medical career to take off. The 24-year-old man had opened up a practice in Tascosa, but it wasn't exactly paying the bills, at least not anymore. When he had first arrived the year before, there was a smallpox epidemic sweeping through the region, and he had arrived just in time to wipe it out. And with it, his means of living. He wrote of this and said, quote, "Smallpox soon faded away, and there was little for me to do. There were all kinds of hunting, plenty of adventure and excitement, and I was enjoying life, but my income diminished, and it was not long until a debonair young medico, distinguished as the first to locate and practice medicine and surgery in the Texas Panhandle, was in that financial condition commonly known as flat broke." End quote. We've all been there, brother. Once back in the small town, the two Henrys, Henry Hoyt and Henry McCarty, a.k.a. William H. Bonney, a.k.a. Billy the Kid, the two became fast friends. And of course, they regularly attended Tascosa's dance parties or bailes. In Tascosa, the bailes were often thrown by a Hispanic man known as Pedro Romero. Hoyt actually describes a funny scene in which he and Billy the Kid raced to one of the dances. He wrote, quote, "On a beautiful moonlit night, a Romero baile was in full swing. The Kid and I stepped out to enjoy it, and incidentally strolled across the plaza, about 100 yards in width, to Reinhardt's store opposite. Returning, I challenged the Kid to a foot race to the dance hall. I led him all the way. As we neared the door, I slacked up, while Billy kept on at full speed through the door." End quote. Apparently, after barreling through the door, Billy's foot caught an uneven board. He soared through the air and landed all sprawled out right there in the middle of the dance floor. When they weren't dancing, Billy and Hoyt and Tom Folliard, they were all playing poker, a game Billy the Kid was quite good at. Interestingly, neither Billy the Kid nor Henry Hoyt drank a single drop of whiskey the entire time they were hanging out in the plains. Hoyt wrote that he never once saw Billy, quote, "taking a drink of liquor all the time he was in the Panhandle." End quote. Hoyt also describes Billy the Kid. He wrote that he was, quote, "a handsome youth with smooth face, wavy brown hair, an athletic and symmetrical figure, and clear blue eyes that could look one through and through. Unless angry, he always seemed to have a pleasant expression with a ready smile. His head was well shaped, his features regular, his nose aquiline, his most noticeable characteristic, a slight projection of his 2 upper front teeth." End quote. Just like in Lincoln and Fort Sumner, Billy was loved by the Hispanic New Mexican ladies. As we will no doubt talk about later, Billy the Kid loved himself some Latinas, and they loved him back. But again, it's strange that everyone describes him as handsome. It's strange because the only picture we have of him makes him look kind of goofy. He's always mentioned as dressing well, too, which doesn't square up with the only picture we have of him. But maybe the camera caught him on a bad day. It happens to us all. Well, not my wife. But I'll talk about that picture in the next coming episodes, because there are people that were there and knew him at the time that would even comment on the picture and how off it was. Eventually, the fun in the Panhandle was bound to come to an end. Hoyt had decided to pick up shop and move to Las Vegas. Before he left, though, as a sign of their friendship, Billy the Kid would give Henry Hoyt the best of his stolen horses for free. He even signed a bill of sale to the young man. A bill of sale which is now housed in the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum. Then once word of the president's orders in Lincoln County reached Tascosa, the Regulators decided it was time to truly disband. From the Panhandle, the leader of the Regulators, Middleton, decided he'd had enough, and he and Waite returned home to Oklahoma, or Indian Territory at that time. Middleton would actually continue on to Kansas. Brown, too, would head to Kansas, where later in life he would become a sheriff. The more I learn of the Old West, the more I read of outlaws becoming lawmen and lawmen becoming outlaws. Heck, Lincoln County had this theme constantly. And a man I have mentioned a few times, Billy the Kid's killer, Pat Garrett, even fits this mold. Heck, Selman of Selman Scouts, which I just discussed, will later become a lawman and was one before. I mean, that's even despite everything I described about Selman Scouts in Lincoln, which I will get back to in a minute. That left young Tom Folliard and young William H. Bonney the Kid. They decided it best not to return to Lincoln County, and instead they headed to Fort Sumner, where Charlie Beaudry and Doc Scurlock were settling down with their wives. So over in Lincoln County, the president's proclamation worked, and Boss Rustler Kinney with his Seven Rivers boys, as well as Selman and his scouts, they had all fled the territory and had headed for Texas, or Mexico, or both. Regardless, by the time Billy the Kid and Tom Folliard reached Fort Sumner, the troubles in Lincoln County had subsided once again. And around this time, the head of the Lincoln House, the ex-soldier Lawrence Murphy, died at 48 of cancer. It was no doubt good news for the remainder of the Regulators and the people of Lincoln. But then even more good news came when the new governor, on November 13th, issued a blanket pardon for all crimes that had been perpetrated in Lincoln County from February of 78 to that very moment. Now, of course, this pardon did not include those who had indictments for crimes prior to that, which means Billy the Kid still had a warrant out for his arrest. Billy, Beaudry, and Scurlock all had warrants, actually, but they all felt safe in San Miguel County at Fort Sumner, which is where they would stay for a few months. Susan McSween had since returned back to Lincoln, and she was accompanied by her new lawyer. The two were attempting to press charges against the commander of Fort Stanton, Dudley Do-Right. This would have been for the murder of her husband, Alex McSween. This lawyer, Houston Ingraham Chapman, would go on a large letter-writing campaign to the governor and tell him all about the incompetence and malfeasance that Dudley had overseen. There would be some troubles with a Fort Stanton officer, which would result in Dudley forbidding any soldiers to go to Lincoln ever again. This officer, Lieutenant French, would accuse Chapman, the lawyer, and Miss McSween as being lovers and being the leader of a band of outlaws. Total bogus on both counts. Dolan of the House, who was now in charge since Murphy had died, he would also write the governor and complain that the lawyer and Miss McSween were trying to reignite the feud. Dolan would write, quote, "I and many citizens feel confident that if this man, Chapman, was silenced, the trouble would end." End quote. It was a rather prophetic way to end the letter, as you will see. Interesting side note. Before Susan McSween and the lawyer came to Lincoln from Las Vegas, they wrote Dudley and asked for soldiers to accompany them, since so many men wanted Susan dead. Dudley flat out refused. The governor then got involved and told Dudley straight up that he needed to escort Susan McSween. But from what I can tell, he never did. But that order, obviously, did not go over well with the commander of Fort Stanton, a position Dudley would not hold for much longer. There is a rather incredible and tense interaction with one of Dudley's lieutenants, where the man barges into Susan's house and tries to drunkenly arrest this Chapman chap, the lawyer, only to point his gun at the man and demand he follow him to the fort. Chapman protested, There were insults thrown around. Susan begged the Lieutenant French to leave. Lieutenant French then tried to fight Chapman. The whole thing is ridiculous, and I believe it was all on Dudley's orders. But I have no idea. Before Lieutenant French left, he told Chapman, quote, "My name is Lieutenant French. I belong to the United States Army. I am attached to the 9th Cavalry. I shall meet you again and we shall settle this difficulty." End quote. It won't be French that settles this difficulty. And that story is actually what forced Dudley to ban any soldiers from entering Lincoln. Justice of the Peace Wilson, a man I have mentioned quite a bit, he was actually pretty busy at this time. At the end of 1878 and early 1879, he was busy trying to heal the fractured town of Lincoln, and he was doing all he could to accomplish this seemingly impossible task. In January of 79, Wilson wrote in a letter to the Mesilla Valley Independent, and he said, quote, "Many persons of the two parties heretofore at war with each other are getting together and settling all old difficulties. Several such reconciliations have taken place in my office within the last few days, and through my advice have become friends again, and as far as I can judge, it is the intention of all parties to use their best efforts to settle and forget old quarrels and disputes, and again become friends and aid the enforcement of the law." End quote. His biggest success was Jimmy Dolan and Susan McSween, who apparently shook hands and called a truce within the walls of Wilson's office. Justice of the peace indeed. Wilson was also working hard on a pardon for the remaining regulators. He had Chapman, the attorney hired by Miss McSween. He had him write Tunstall's father to see if he could do anything from his position across the pond, as in to help the men who had charges against them. Wilson eventually sent word to Billy the Kid and Tom Folliard over in Fort Sumner that the townsfolk and leading citizens of Lincoln wanted them to come in and reconcile their differences. I'm sure Billy the Kid and Tom talked it over many a day. They were, after all, having fun in Fort Sumner with their friends Doc Scurlock and Charlie Beaudry. They were attending the dances and they were playing games at the saloon where Pat Garrett was still bartender. They no doubt became friends with him too, interestingly enough, maybe not close friends. But Billy the Kid and his killer, future Sheriff Pat Garrett, were close enough to consider each other acquaintances. But eventually, the two regulators, or I guess by this point ex-regulators, they thought it prudent to head to Lincoln and bury the hatchet. In town, they'd stay at the Ellis store, the same place they had a year prior. They'd meet up with their friend Sam Corbett. They probably looked on in sadness at the remains of the McSween home. It no longer would have been smoldering. Maybe they visited the graves of their friends. But ultimately, according to Sam Corbett, 1 year exactly to the day that Tunstall was murdered on February 18th, 1879, quote, "Billy Bonney, tired of fighting, made friends with the Dolan outfit." End quote. The wording of the truce was published in a few of the sources and even by a newspaper at the time, so I will quote them here. According to the Mesilla Independent, the terms of the truce were as followed. Quote, 1. That neither party would kill any member of the other party without first having given notice of having withdrawn from agreement. 2. That all persons who had acted as friends were included in the agreement and were not to be molested. 3. That no officer or soldiers were to be killed for any act previous to the date of this agreement. 4. That neither party should appear to give evidence against the other in any civil prosecution. That is a big one. And 5. That each party should give individual members of the other party every aid in their power to resist arrests upon civil warrants, and if necessary, they would try to secure their release. 6. That if any member of either party failed to carry out this compact, which was sworn to by the respective leaders, then he should be killed on sight. End quote. Killed on sight for anyone who goes against this truce. After the truce, which saw Billy the Kid, Tom Folliard, leader of the house Jimmy Dolan, leader of the boys Jesse Evans, Campbell, and a man named Edgar Walls, who was the brother-in-law of the leader of the Santa Fe Ring, Tom Catrone, They all met at an undisclosed location, after which they had many a drink to celebrate. Campbell, whom I just mentioned, was Billy Campbell. He was a cowhand for the Dolan Murphy house until 1876, which is when he shot a man in Lincoln Town over a slight against a girl he liked. After the shooting, Dolan advised the man to hightail it out of town, which he did. So he was absent for the Lincoln County War. But the dangerous man was about to reignite it, along with the help of Jimmy Dolan. Now, I'm not sure if Billy the Kid had anything to drink, as he wasn't a heavy drinker, and as I had just mentioned, he didn't have a drop during his time in the Texas Panhandle. Tom Folliard probably hadn't had much, if any, to drink either. He kind of followed what Billy's lead was. Dolan, Walls, and Campbell, though, they were quite drunk. But not mere hours after the two sides made peace, the entire lot of them headed out into the street of Lincoln and began walking towards Allen J. Ballard's saloon. And it is frustrating what happens next, especially after such good news and events occurred in succession of one another. The peace, the truth, and the work behind the scenes of the attorney Chapman, who may get Billy the Kid and Folliard and the other regulators a pardon. And speaking of the attorney Chapman, he had, that very same night, returned to Lincoln from either Las Vegas or Santa Fe. I read both. He was, as I just said, still working on a pardon, and more importantly, he was working on charges against Dudley Do-Right for the murder of Alexander McSween. He had arrived that night during the handshakes of peace and the pouring of drinks, and he had headed to Miss McSween, who was staying across the street from her destroyed home. There, Chapman told Miss McSween of the good news that he had spoken with the governor, and he was himself coming down to Lincoln to investigate. After giving the good news and saying goodbye to Susan, Chapman exited the house and began walking towards the Tunstall store. At the same time, Billy, Folliard, Walls, Dolan, and Campbell were fatefully heading towards the saloon. I will let Matthews describe what frustratingly happens next. Quote, "The attorney stepped out of Susan McSween's home into a pitch-black night. Just as he reached the street, he encountered the earlier peacemakers. By this time, Dolan, Evans, and Campbell were quite drunk. Bonnie, known to be a light drinker at most, probably was not, and Folliard likely followed Bonnie's example. 'Who are you and where are you going?' bellowed Campbell. 'My name is Chapman, and I am attending to my business,' Chapman answered. Commanded to dance by Campbell, Chapman replied, 'I don't propose to dance for a drunken mob.' 2 shots pierced the darkness. Campbell had fired his revolver. Quote, 'the ball going in at the breast and coming out at the back,' end quote. As Chapman fell, quote, Dolan shot him with his Winchester. End all quotes. And just like that, the peace was shattered. Also, the image of commanding someone to dance at the barrel of a gun apparently is not just a movie trope. Maybe the trope came from this incident, or maybe it was just a common practice at the time. I read that Dolan would later admit that he had fired first after the two sides argued and in the ordering of the dance. Either way, Chapman was dead and his clothing was on fire. He either caught fire from the gunshot or they doused him with whiskey and lit him on fire to destroy the papers he was carrying. At this point, I imagine Billy the Kid and Tom Folliard are stunned. Not only from the unnecessary violence, but also it was 1 year to the day that Tunstall had been murdered. And here lay another murdered man by the same hands as the first one. Or hand, at least. Dolan's hand. I'm sure Billy and Tom wanted to run, but if they did, they knew they would no doubt receive the same treatment as Chapman, and they would be blamed for the murder, and the 3 men would say they killed the 2 kids justifiably. Maurice Fulton even writes that when Billy and Tom tried to leave before the shooting, Jesse Evans grabbed hold of them and kept them on the spot. So with no other choice, the 2 hostages, they left the dead attorney, whose clothes were on fire, They left him in the street and followed the men of the house to the saloon, where they ate canned oysters and drank more whiskey. No one in town bothered to see the evidence of the violence they were used to by now. At some point, Tom Folliard excused himself, maybe to go to the bathroom, but instead he ran to the Ellis house. Shortly afterwards, realizing that they had just shot a man who was unarmed, because it was known that Chapman never carried a gun. But realizing this mistake, Jimmy Dolan handed his pistol over to Edgar Walls and told him to go put it in the dead attorney's hand. Walls refused. Seeing an opportunity, though, Billy the Kid offered to do it for Walls and Dolan. Probably with a smirk and a happy feeling in seeing he truly had a new ally, Dolan handed the revolver to the Kid, who quickly left the saloon, walked past the dead smoldering man, and entered the Ellis store where Folliard was waiting for him. Once at the Ellis house, Ellis, Corbett, Folliard, and the Kid talked over what happened and what to do next. It will be reported by a few newspapers that Tom and Billy had no part in the killing, and that in fact they had tried to leave when they sensed murderous intent, but were unsuccessful. As Maurice Fulton wrote in regards to one of these published letters, he wrote, quote, "The correspondent of 34 makes it plain that Billy the Kid and his associates were not implicated in the Chapman killing. In fact, they had tried to keep out of possible trouble by withdrawing from the celebration, but had been forced to go along. At the beginning of the encounter with Chapman, Billy the Kid sensed a killing and tried to slip away, but Jesse Evans seized hold of him and forced him to remain. This reluctance to be involved in any revival of shooting scrapes must be taken as evidence of the Kid's sincerity in the formulation of the peace conference that had a short while before adjourned." End quote. It seems no matter how hard he tries to leave, Billy the Kid's always pulled back in. Wisely, Folliard and Billy decided to get the heck out of Dodge. They jumped up on their horses and immediately left town for a place known as Las Tablas, about 20 miles north of Lincoln. And it was a very good thing they did. Right after the two Regulators rode north, the new sheriff in town, George Kimbrell, entered Lincoln with a posse of 20 soldiers from Stanton who were led by Lieutenant Dawson. Sheriff Kimbrell was there to finally issue the arrest warrants, except none of the Regulators could be found in town. What the new sheriff and the lieutenant did find, though, was the dead attorney lying in the middle of the street. Chapman had been lying there for 24 hours. The lieutenant and his men carried the body to the courthouse before heading back to the fort the following morning. A month later, despite the man he had promised to visit being murdered, the governor of the territory of New Mexico came to Lincoln. It was March 5th when Governor Wallace entered town, and he immediately had arrest warrants issued for Campbell, Dolan, and Jesse Evans for the murder of Chapman the attorney. The governor also, and unfortunately, sent soldiers with an arrest warrant to find and capture Billy the Kid and Tom Folliard for accessory to the attorney's murder. Despite them having nothing to do with it, it was wrong place, wrong time. And probably, if I had to guess, it was on purpose. The soldiers were too late, though, and Billy and Tom Folliard had already left Las Tablas for Fort Sumner. During the governor's considerable time in Lincoln, Wallace had Dudley removed and another man take his place until, surprisingly, Purrington, the former head of the fort, could return and become head of the fort yet again. Oh, and the governor also had arrest warrants made for all 8 former Regulators: Middleton, Doc Scurlock, Waite, Brown, Beaudry, French, Folliard, and Billy the Kid. A week later, Billy the Kid from Fort Sumner would write the governor with an offer. Essentially, he said, "If you pardon my warrants, I'll be a witness and testify against those who killed the attorney Chapman." Here is the Kid's letter in its entirety. Quote, "To His Excellency the Governor, General Lew Wallace. Dear Sir, I have heard that you will give $1,000 for my body, which, as I can understand it, means alive, as a witness. I know it is as a witness against those that murdered Mr. Chapman. If it was so as that I could appear at court, I could give the desired information, but I have indictments against me for things that happened in the late Lincoln County War, and am afraid to give up because my enemies would kill me. The day Mr. Chapman was murdered, I was in Lincoln at the request of good citizens to meet Mr. J.J. Dolan, to meet as friends, so as to be able to lay aside our arms and go to work. I was present when Mr. Chapman was murdered, and know who did it, and if it were not for those indictments, I would have made it clear before now. If it is in your power to annul those indictments, I hope you will do so as to give me a chance to explain. Please send me an answer by bearer. I have no wish to fight any more. Indeed, I have not raised an arm since your proclamation. As to my character, I refer to any of the citizens, for the majority of them are my friends and have been helping me all they could. I am called Kid Antrim, but Antrim is my stepfather's name. Waiting an answer, I remain your obedient servant, W.H. Bonney. End quote. Now, I will quote author Matthews on what unfolds after Billy sent the letter. Bonney's letter, undated, was delivered to Wallace, probably on Friday, March 14, 1879. The next day, Wallace replied, telling Bonney to come to Wilson's home. That's Justice of the Peace Wilson. Come to Wilson's home, quote, at 9 o'clock next Monday night alone. I don't mean his office, but his residence. Follow along the foot of the mountain south of the town. Come in on that side and knock at the east door. I have authority to exempt you from prosecution if you will testify to what you say you know. End quote. Wallace explained the purpose of the meeting. Quote, the object of the meeting at Wilson's is to arrange the matter in a way to make your life safe. To do that, the utmost secrecy is to be used. So come alone. Don't tell anybody, not a living soul, where you are coming or the object. If you could trust Jesse Evans, you can trust me. End quote. On Monday evening, March 17th, Billy Bonney, probably only a month shy of his 19th birthday, honored the 52-year-old governor's request to meet at Wilson's house. Bonney approached Wilson's home as Wallace had instructed. At exactly 9 o'clock, Bonney knocked on Wilson's door. A voice called out, "Come in." Wallace later recalled, quote, the door opened somewhat slowly and carefully, and there stood the young fellow generally known as the Kid, his Winchester in his right hand, his revolver in his left. End quote. Stepping toward Wallace, sitting behind a table, Bonney remarked, quote, I was sent for to meet the governor here at 9 o'clock. Is he here? End quote. Wallace rose to his feet and said, I am Governor Wallace. Bonney said warily, your note gave promise of absolute protection. To which Wallace replied, yes, and I have been true to my promise. Then, pointing to Wilson sitting in a chair away from the table, Wallace added, this man, whom of course you know, and I, are the only persons in the house. Bonney lowered his rifle and returned his revolver to its holster. Wallace extended his hand across the table and invited Bonney to have a seat. The two men shook hands, and Bonney sat down. The governor told Bonney that in return for his court testimony identifying Chapman's murderers, quote, I will let you go scot-free with a pardon in your pocket. End quote. Bonney must have been elated. The Kid, recalled Wallace, talked over the details of this plan for his fake arrest with a good deal of zest. He even ventured the suggestion that he should be kept handcuffed during his confinement, in order to give a bona fide coloring to the whole proceeding. Still, Bonney did not commit to the governor's plan. He told Wallace he would think about it and let him know, quote, in a few days what his decision was. End all quotes. You'd think the story would be over right here. But like the story so far, fate had other ideas. The day after this clandestine meeting in Lincoln between Billy and the governor, Jesse Evans and William Campbell, who had been captured and who were sitting in the guardhouse at Fort Sumner for the last 10 days, well, they both escaped. They escaped from the guardhouse. Whether they had help or not is unknown, but I do not doubt it. Upon hearing this, Billy from San Patricio sent another message to Justice Wilson and asked him to pass it along to Governor Wallace, whom he titled, You Know Who. He wrote, quote, Please tell you know who that I do not know what to do, now as those prisoners have escaped, to send word by bearer a note through you. It may be that he has made different arrangements. If not, and he still wants it the same, to send William Hudgens as deputy to the junction, confluence of Bonito and Ruidoso rivers, tomorrow at 3 o'clock with some men you know to be all right. Send a note telling me what to do. P.S. Do not send soldiers. End quote. Clearly, Billy did not trust the new sheriff. This is Sheriff Kimbrell. He had mostly been neutral in the Lincoln County War, but he was briefly a deputy to Sheriff Pepin. Billy didn't trust the soldiers either. Why would he after they watched McSween's house burn down, didn't stop the killing, and supposedly, backed by the word of 2 regulators, shot at Billy and his friends as he tried to escape? Justice Wilson sent the notes to the governor over at the fort, who read them and then sent this reply. The escape makes no difference in arrangements. To remove the suspicion of understanding, I think it better to put the arresting party in charge of Sheriff Kimbrell, who shall be instructed to see that no violence is used. This will go to you tonight. If I don't receive other word from you, the party, all citizens, will be at the junction by 3 o'clock tomorrow. End quote. Governor Wallace also sent a letter to Wilson that read, quote, I enclose a note for Bonnie. Read it and forward at once. I presume the messenger is in waiting. If you know why Kimbrell should not go rather than Hudgens, hold on till I get over to Lincoln this evening. End quote. So it seems even the governor was willing to listen and work with Billy the Kid. Again, all should go swimmingly if all parties play their hands right. Should being the key word there. But again, what reason does Bonnie the Kid have to trust anyone except Wilson? And as you'll see, Wallace's word in the end won't be worth the paper it's written on when it comes to the kid. Billy sent his reply. It was a long reply filled with thoughts and suggestions, and ultimately, I believe, as he was writing it, he started having second thoughts. He wrote to Governor Wallace that he would, quote, keep the appointment I made, but be sure and have men come that you can depend on. I am not afraid to die like a man fighting, but I would not like to be killed like a dog unarmed. Tell Kimbrell to let his men be placed around the house and for him to come in alone, and he can arrest us. That is me and Tom Folliard. End quote. The kid believed that after he surrendered, that he and Tom would be prisoners at the fort, so he wrote, quote, all I am afraid of is that in the fort we might be poisoned or killed through a window at night. But you can arrange that all right. Tell the commanding officer to watch Lieutenant Goodwin. He would not hesitate to do anything. There will be danger on the road of somebody waylaying us to kill us on the road to the fort. End quote. The kid then gave some suggestions on how to catch the 2 escaped murderers, Evans and Campbell. He wrote, quote, you will never catch these fellows on the road. Watch Fritz's, Captain Baca's ranch, and the brewery. They will either go to Seven Rivers or to the Hickory Mountains. They will stay close until the scouting parties come in. Give a spy a pair of glasses and let him get on the mountain back of Fritz's and watch. And if they are, there will be provisions carried to them. It is not my place to advise you, but I am anxious to have them caught, and perhaps know how men hide from soldiers better than you. Please excuse me for having so much to say, and I still remain, yours truly, W. H. Bonney. End quote. Lastly, he gave a postscript that read, quote, P.S. I have changed my mind. Send Kimbrell to Gutierrez is just below San Patricio 1 mile, because Sanger and Ballard, 2 Lincoln County residents, are, or were, great friends of Billy Campbell's. Ballard told me yesterday to leave, for you were doing everything to catch me. It was a blind to get me to leave. Tell Kimbrell not to come before 3 o'clock, for I may not be there before. End quote. This Ballard that Billy speaks of was indeed very good friends with Campbell and Dolan and the house. As a matter of fact, in a few months' time, Dolan would marry one of the Fritz women. Fritz of the life insurance check. Dolan would marry Fritz's daughter at Ballard's home. The man, Ballard, was trying to get Billy to flee so he would not testify against his friend Dolan, who Ballard knew murdered the attorney Chapman. The house will always win. The following day at 3 p.m., a mile south of San Patricio, which was itself southeast of Lincoln, Billy the Kid and Tom Folliard surrendered to a citizens' posse led by Sheriff Kimbrell. They were then taken to Lincoln. The citizens' posse had recently been formed by the governor, and he called it the Lincoln County Mounted Rifles, so it was more like a militia. This militia was led by the trusty Juan Patron and had 37 other Lincoln men in its ranks. Many of them were Hispanics, and many of them were allied or had been allied to McSween and the Regulators. In other words, these were Billy and Tom's friends. One of the Ellis sons, Ben, the one who'd been shot in the throat, he was in the posse. McSween's hired Negro, George Washington, was in the ranks. A lot of New Mexican Hispanics who'd been there fighting for McSween during the big kill were there as well. Men like Jose Chavez y Chavez and Salazar. Salazar had survived the gunshot and had crawled back to his sister-in-law's as McSween's burned. It must have eased Billy and Tom's minds to know that the men taking them in could be trusted. And then, much to Billy and Tom's further relief, they were not sent to Fort Stanton, which was then under the direction of Purrington. Instead, they were put up at Juan Patron's own home, without guard. Governor Wallace was staying next door. Wallace wrote, quote, "I did not require that the kid and his companion be kept under strict confinement, and was entirely willing for him to have a good many privileges." End quote. 2 days later, Billy the Kid and the governor had their second face-to-face. In the meeting, Billy told the man everything he knew about the boys, the Seven Rivers boys, and Boss Kinney, Selman's scouts, the house, and every other outlaw in the region. He told him about the horse thieving and the battle at McSween's. He told him everything. And then the following day they had yet another face-to-face. It seems Billy truly trusted the governor. A trust that will not be reciprocated when it matters. I will now quote from author Matthews, who knows how this story ends just as well as I do. He wrote, quote, "A week later, on March 31st, Wallace revealed his real feelings toward Bonnie in a letter to Secretary of the Interior Carl Schurz. Quote, "A precious specimen nicknamed the Kid, whom the sheriff is holding here in the plaza, as it is called, is an object of tender regard. I heard singing and music the other night. Going to the door, I found the minstrels of the village actually serenading this fellow in his prison." End quote. The governor's snide characterization of Bonnie as a precious specimen showed Wallace did not share Bonnie's friendly feelings, nor did Wallace understand the friendly feelings Lincoln residents had for Bonnie. His letter to Schurz omitted Bonnie's status as a star witness against Chapman's murderers and failed to mention his promised pardon to Bonnie. Instead, Wallace portrayed Bonnie as an outlaw whom the sheriff is holding here in the plaza, and told Schurz, quote, "The desperados include some of the most noted of their class in the United States." End quote. It would seem that Governor Wallace had no intention to honor his promised pardon. End all quotes. Billy will hang on to this pardon right up until the end. A week after these meetings, Governor Wallace learned of the whereabouts of Doc Scurlock and Charlie Beaudry. He then sent Juan Patron and his mounted riflemen to capture the two, but they were only successful in getting Doc Scurlock. He too was brought to Patron's house, where he sat confined with Billy and Tom Folliard. It wasn't all bad, though, as the three ate well, played a lot of poker, and smoked the finest tobacco while they waited for court. Court began on April 14th, and true to his word, Billy did want that pardon after all, but true to his word, Billy the Kid testified against Dolan and Campbell for the cold-blooded and possibly premeditated murder of the attorney Chapman in the street. Mark Lee Gardner, and To Hell on a Fast Horse, wrote that after the murder, quote, "A joyous Campbell let slip that he had promised Dudley he would kill the troublesome attorney." End quote. Gardner provides no source, but I don't think the killing was an accident. The lawyer was very recognizable, as he apparently had only one arm, and he had a bandage on his face from some disease that was destroying him. So I believe, whether it was Dudley or someone else, that Campbell had been killed on purpose. And if you'll recall, testifying against Dolan was very dangerous for Billy and Tom. If the wording of the truce is to be believed, it meant death to betray the other side of the pact. And the problem was, the prosecutor for the case against the murderers was none other than the murderous William R. Reinerson, a man of the ring, a man of the house, and a man who headed out for Billy the Kid. A week or so earlier, Chapman's law partner, a man named Ira Leonard, had arrived, and he was assigned to prosecute the case with Rynerson. And what Leonard saw in court was horrendous, and the typical misuse of justice that Lincoln County residents had grown accustomed to. He wrote to the governor, who was by now back in Santa Fe. Leonard wrote to the governor during the trial and said, quote, "I tell you, Gov, that the prosecuting officer, William Rynerson, of this district court is no friend of the enforcement of the law. He is bent on going for the kid, and is bent on pushing him to the wall." End quote. Leonard remarked that instead of going after Dolan and Campbell, he was hell-bent on Billy. Leonard would tell the governor this was because Rynerson was, quote, "a Dolan man, and is defending him by his conduct all he can." End quote. Every observer in Lincoln County eventually learns the House always wins, whether it's from around the table or sitting at it themselves. Despite the crookedness of Rynerson, though, the grand jury of Lincoln County came through yet again, just as they had done a year earlier. Although a lot of good that had done in the end, and a lot of good it would do this time. The grand jury indicted Dolan and Campbell for Chapman's murder, and they charged Jesse Evans as an accessory to said murder. Dudley was actually indicted for arson against McSween, surprisingly. Tom Folliard was indicted on horse thieving, but when he mentioned the governor's pardon, he was set free. Surprisingly, Governor Wallace actually instructed Rynerson, and this is surprising, to drop all charges against Billy the Kid. So he was true to his word, for a time, in some small capacity. The governor could have and should have dropped the charges himself instead of asking the corrupt district attorney to drop them for him. But he never would issue that pardon to Billy. And Rynerson refused to drop the charges, and instead he changed the venue to Doña Ana County, where, of course, the also corrupt and part of the ring Judge Bristol awaited. Bristol, naturally, accepted the change of venue. Billy's charges were not dropped. Court was set for October in Mesilla, under Judge Bristol and Rynerson, both members of the Santa Fe ring. After court, Campbell and Evans would leave New Mexico for Texas, of course. Dolan knew the score, so he would stick around and eventually be acquitted, despite putting a rifle shot through the attorney, despite being a cold-blooded murderer, despite being the corrupt catalyst for the entire Lincoln County War, or at least a large part of it. So he was a free man, and soon he would be married. Billy would testify against Dudley Do-Right in his court-martial. Billy assumed it would help his own case. It didn't. The governor still refused to issue the pardon he promised. The court-martial actually took 6 weeks, and Maurice Fulton published the entire court transcript of Billy the Kid being examined and cross-examined. It is very fascinating, but I don't have the time to read it, and y'all wouldn't want me to anyways. It painstakingly goes over the big kill and the burning of McSween's home. Billy also swears under oath that 3 soldiers fired at him and his friends during the escape, and that the firing most likely caused the death of one of his friends. In the end, Dudley would be acquitted of most of the charges, and curiously, after the trial, Dudley would end up placing the blame of the entire disastrous and deadly affair at the feet of the Santa Fe ring, everyone's favorite punching bag, and for good reason. Eventually, as the court date approached, and as he began to realize he had no hope of getting off in Mesilla under Bristol and Rynerson, Billy the Kid, Doc Scurlock, and Tom Folliard excused themselves from Patron's house and headed for Fort Sumner. It was June 17, 1879. As Billy himself put it, quote, "I went up to Lincoln to stand my trial on the warrant that was out for me, but the territory took a change of venue to Doña Ana County, and I knew that I had no show, and so I skinned out." End quote. Maurice Fulton's version of Billy's quote-unquote escape pretty much says the same thing. Juan Patron and the mounted riflemen were almost all McSween partisans, and they knew Billy had no chance in court, so they no doubt set him free. Fulton writes, quote, "From the captain, Juan Patron, down to the lowest private, they were almost without an exception friendly to him, and they knew his arrest and detention were purely voluntary on his part. One version even has it that Juan Patron, seeing that the Dolan faction were taking shelter under the governor's pardon, though no move was being made towards permitting Billy the Kid to do likewise, said to him one day, quote, "Kid, I'll give you a horse and a Winchester. Then let's see if they can capture you." End quote. The hint seems to have been sufficient. A morning or two later, so the story goes, he remarked to his guards, "Boys, I'm tired of this. Tell the General Wallace I'm tired." Then, slipping off his handcuffs, he walked out of the building and across the street to where a horse was hitched. Swinging into the saddle, he rode away in broad daylight, headed towards Fort Sumner, which by that time had supplanted San Patricio as his favorite haunt. End all quotes. I believe it is here where Billy the Kid becomes a true outlaw. I think the other murderers were justified. Killing Windy Bill as he was getting beat up. Killing the corrupt sheriff who was going to kill McSween. His fighting at Blazer's Mill and during the big kill. I think all of those things were justified. But once he skips out on court because the governor refuses to give him the pardon, Billy takes a turn for true outlawry, as you will hear coming up. And it is a shame. Things could have turned out so much different for Billy the Kid. Back in Fort Sumner, the bailes continued. Life was good. They were more or less free men. Billy the Kid and Tom Folliard were inseparable friends, and Tom really looked up to Billy. Mark Lee Gardner in To Hell on a Fast Horse describes their friendship. While Gardner plays loose with the facts in the story, I still enjoyed reading his book, and I like quoting from him. He wrote, quote, "He, Tom Folliard, he was very close to Billy in personality, good-natured and fun-loving, always singing or humming a song to himself. He was the Kid's inseparable companion," recalled Frank Coe, "and always went along and held his horses. He held his horses when the Kid would pay his attentions to some Mexican girl. It mattered not whether he was gone 30 minutes or half the night. Tom was there when he came out." End all quotes. And Tom had plenty of opportunities to hold Billy's horses. As mentioned earlier, the ladies loved Billy the Kid. One young woman in particular described him quite well. This woman was the daughter of the man who made Fort Sumner what it was after the Army had sold the land to him. That man was Lucien Maxwell, and his daughter, Paulita Maxwell, wrote of the Kid fondly. She wrote that he, quote, "cut quite a gallant figure at those affairs. He was not handsome, but he had a certain sort of boyish good looks. He was always smiling and good-natured and very polite, and danced remarkably well. And the little Mexican beauties made eyes at him from behind their fans and used all their coquetries to capture him and were very vain of his attentions." End quote. Okay, so not handsome, but quite charming. Paulita also said that Billy, quote, "fascinated many women. In every placida on the Pecos, some little senorita was proud to be known as his querida, beloved." End quote. Certainly, the 15-year-old Paulita, as Matthews wrote, was fascinated by the young outlaw. In 1924, Paulita Maxwell would be interviewed about her time with Billy the Kid at Fort Sumner. This is what she would say over 40 years later. So, time can change the story. But this is what she said, quote, "An old story that identifies me as Billy the Kid's sweetheart has been going the rounds for many years. Perhaps it honors me, perhaps not. But I was not Billy the Kid's sweetheart. I liked him very much, oh yes, but I did not love him. He was a nice boy, at least to me, courteous, gallant, always respectful. I used to meet him at dances. He was, of course, often at our house. But he and I had no thoughts of marriage. But if I had loved the Kid, and he had loved me, I will say that I would not have hesitated to marry him and follow him through danger, poverty, or hardship to the ends of the earth, in spite of anything he had ever done, or what the world might have been pleased to think of me. This is the way of Spanish girls when they are in love. There was a story that Billy and I had laid our plans to elope to Old Mexico. There was another tale that we proposed to elope riding double on one horse. Neither story was true, and the one about eloping on one horse was a joke. Pete Maxwell, my brother, had more horses than he knew what to do with, and if Billy and I had wanted to set off for the Rio Grande by the light of the moon, you may depend upon it, we would at least have had separate mounts. I did not need to put my arms around any man's waist to keep from falling off a horse. Not I. I was, if you please, brought up in the saddle and plumed myself on my horsemanship. End quote. Now, at the end of this series, there will be a little story, and I'm not sure who it involves, but my inkling is that it is Paulita Maxwell, but we'll get there in a couple episodes. In early 1880, a tin-type photographer would come to Fort Sumner, and that is when the only picture of Billy the Kid still left with us was taken. He looks goofy in it. He looks unkempt. His appearance goes against what all the ladies say about him. And Paulita Maxwell agrees. She'd later write of the photograph and say, quote, "I never liked the picture. I don't think it does Billy justice. It makes him look rough and uncouth. The expression of his face was really boyish and very pleasant. He may have worn such clothes as appear in the picture out on the range, but in Fort Sumner he was careful of his personal appearance and dressed neatly and in good taste." End quote. Around this time, actually a little before this photograph of him was taken, it is reported, or rather it will be reported 50 years later by Billy's friend from the Panhandle, Henry Hoyt. But Hoyt will 50 years after 1879, right about the time Billy the Kid came up to see him at the Las Vegas Hot Springs. And with Billy was Jesse James. The Jesse James. It's a great story. Not a true one, mind you, but a neat one. No, at this time, Billy would stick around Fort Sumner with his old buddies, and the only time he left was to go to the Texas Panhandle to steal horses and cattle. There are other stories from before this time in early 79 and after this time in early 80, and all of them seem to be myths. Maurice Fulton even doubts a story he writes, but he included it anyways. He wrote, quote, "A group of the old McSween crowd, by some accounts, headed by Billy the Kid, came down from Fort Sumner and took possession of the town so completely as to make those of the other factions, such as Dolan, Billy Matthews, and John Long, hurry to the protection of Fort Stanton." End quote. And there is just no evidence that this raid ever happened. Billy stayed at Fort Sumner. He was never in charge of any gang. As a matter of fact, Fulton writes of the incident and says, quote, "Details of the reoccupation of Lincoln by the former McSween sympathizers seem almost lacking." End quote. There's also a story that Billy the Kid got arrested again in Lincoln, but that he escaped. Fulton writes, quote, "When he was again under arrest, he is said to have penciled on the door a reference to the fact he had been there, incarcerated first time December 22nd, 1878. But all the circumstances have faded away, even as to the jailbreak that probably was the mode of his regaining liberty." End quote. So again, there's not much evidence, really none, except myth, that Billy left Fort Sumner around this time, except to go to the Texas Panhandle. There are many more myths and legends attributed to Billy the Kid that may or may not have happened, probably didn't happen. And some of these myths may have happened with someone else, but later got pinned to Billy by the passing of time. Heck, even those stories that got attributed to him later are probably wholly untrue and never happened. He is said to have killed 21 men before he was 21. History has indeed been mixed up with myth when it comes to Billy the Kid. Billy and Tom spent most of their time around the summer and fall of 79 gambling and dancing at Sumner. Billy became good acquaintances with the bartender, a man I will open the next episode with, Billy's future killer, Pat Garrett. Billy and Tom Folliard, along with Doc Scurlock and Charlie Beaudry and a few others. In the fall of that year, they even were reported to have stolen 100 head of cattle from their old friend who had abandoned them. That old friend was John Chisholm. I am not sure if they did or not, but someone certainly did. And soon Billy and Tom will indeed steal some of Chisholm's cattle, but that's for the next episode. Chisholm got so fed up with all the thieving yet again that he would write Governor General Wallace and ask him to place 10 or so armed and deputized men at a spring known as Stinking Springs, which is east of Fort Sumner. He wanted these men to guard against the Texans who were raiding the Pecos Valley. Wallace would ignore the request, but the request is curious for one particular reason. In his request, John Chisholm named a man specifically to lead this small unit. This man had no prior law enforcement background, although he would become famous for that later. But Chisholm named Pat Garrett the bartender to lead the men in Chisholm's fight against rustling. Again, we'll get all caught up with Pat Garrett in the next episode. For soon the story of Billy the Kid will become a cat and mouse game against the man with deadly consequences. Speaking of deadly consequences, on January 10th, 1880, Billy the Kid, without a doubt, shot and killed a random wandering Texan named Joe Grant in a saloon at Fort Sumner. There aren't any details of how they met, but we know they knew each other, even if it was very briefly. It seems by all accounts that Joe Grant was in the region for the sole purpose of becoming an outlaw, and his first act was to kill the kid himself. Billy would later be asked why he killed Joe Grant, and his reply was, quote, "Oh, nothing. It was a game of two and I got there first." End quote. The Santa Fe New Mexican would write, quote, "Billy Bonney, more extensively known as the Kid, shot and killed Joe Grant. The origin of the difficulty was not learned." End quote. A little bit has since been learned about the incident, though, and that information comes from a man named Paco Anaya. He claims he and a bunch of friends were in the bar when the murder went down. According to Anaya, he was with some friends when Billy the Kid and this Grant fellow came into the saloon, went to the bar, ordered a drink, and then Billy invited Anaya and his friends to come join the two, which they did. At this point, the bartender placed a bottle on the bar. The rest of this story is from Paco Anaya's book, I Buried Billy. While this book was published for the first time in 1991, the story is from Paco Anaya's own words. And the title, I Buried Billy, is 100% true. Not only did Paco Anaya hear the shot from Garrett's gun that will kill Billy, but he was one of the first on the scene after the famous gunfighter was killed. He was also at the coroner's jury. He then paid for the clothes that Billy will be buried in. He would later become one of the first state legislatures and then a judge. But this was the first time he ever ran into Billy the Kid. And this is both author Matthews and Paco Anaya's descriptions of what went down in the saloon at Fort Sumner. Quote, "We were starting to serve ourselves when Francisco Tafolla came in. Tafolla was an Indian, and one of the brave ones. He always carried an old pistol, one of those types that was loaded with powder, bullet, and rammer in the old style." And that was Anaya. This is Matthews. But for some reason or other, at this moment, he didn't have it with him. When Frank came in, Billy told him, "Line up, Frank," and Francisco came up to the edge of where the rest of us were. Grant turned to Billy and said, "I don't mind much that you line up with Mexicans, but I can't line up with someone who lines up with Injuns." Tafolla, hearing Grant's insult, angrily left the bar. Everyone knew Tafolla had gone to get his gun. Billy, when Frank went out, moved away from the bar and walked 2 or 3 steps toward the door. Grant drew his gun and called out to Billy, "Bill!" Bonnie turned to face Grant and the barrel of his revolver. Grant squeezed the trigger, but the gun misfired. Billy drew his pistol, quote, in the belt of his pants on the left side and shot 3 shots at him right in the mouth, end quote, Anaya added, perhaps with some exaggeration. This resulted in 1 hole in the back of Grant's head. His hat jumped real high and Grant fell down dead. Billy then turned to Anaya and his friends and said, "I want you all as my witnesses to prove that I killed Grant in self-defense." They all went to the home of the Justice of the Peace, Alejandro Seguro, and Billy admitted he had just killed Grant. The judge interrogated us all, Anaya later wrote, and then decided Billy was free. End all quotes. It had been a close one for Billy, but Providence had saved him. Although, in a year and a half, the life of Billy the Kid would be cut short at the hands of Pat Garrett. Thank y'all for listening, and I'll see you again soon in the American Southwest.
Came down from Alamosa, across the Rio Grande, to track a killer lion, lost his fear, man. First seen around El Rito, he laid a rancher down, killed the rancher's daughter, is gone out of sound. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Not much trace of man out here, the painted canyon walls, the ancient pagan hunters showed the chase and fall. Now the lever action rifle and horses changed the game, but their ghosts still hunt beside me, the chase still feels the same. And the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the hounds my father left me are ranging out of sight. I stand up in my saddle in the early morning light. I can see the good gyp circle, and I know it won't be long till the canyon rings are striking cry, the lion will be found. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Finds a lonely juniper to make his final stand. 3 faithful hounds lie dying, blood shining on the sand. And the good gyp leaps up in the air, as low as murder charge. My rifle cracks, a whisper late, I can feel his iron jaw. The purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Now the eagle sees us falling, the hunter and the prey. His shadow crosses lifeless bodies, where side by side we lay. And the good gyp sits upon the rim, and all alone she cries a death song for her master, killed the mighty lion. Purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds. Yeah, the purple sage and caprock is never out of bounds when you chase the mighty lion behind slobber-headed hounds.